On a fine day on the coast of Brittany, the marina at Lorient is one of the prettiest places in France. Yachts and racing trimarans crowd the water. People sit on the quay with coffee and watch the sails go out toward the Atlantic. And behind all of it, refusing to blend in, stand three enormous blocks of gray concrete. They have no windows worth the name. Their roofs are thick enough to shrug off an earthquake. During the Second World War, the Allies dropped roughly 4,000 tons of bombs on this port and flew hundreds of raids against it. They burned close to 90% of the town to the ground, and in all of that, they never once destroyed a single submarine inside these walls. Not one. This is the entire story of the Lorient U-boat pens. The base the bombers could never crack. For most of the war, this was one of the most dangerous places on Earth for a British sailor, and one of the safest in the world for a German submarine. From these pens, the U-boats went out into the North Atlantic to hunt the convoys that kept Britain alive, and to these pens they came back, sliding in under 7 meters of reinforced concrete that no bomb in the Allied arsenal could break. The Allies knew exactly where the submarines slept. They simply could not reach them. So the real question that hangs over Lorient is not how the Germans built something the bombs could not touch. It is how, in the end, the base was beaten anyway. Because it was. Just not from the air, and not by the men everyone remembers. If this is your first time here, we tell the stories of the places the war turned into fortresses and the people caught inside them. If that is what you came for, take a second to like this video and subscribe. It helps more than you would think. To understand why Lorient became a fortress at all, you have to go back to the summer of 1940 and a problem the Germans were suddenly delighted to have. France had fallen. In a matter of weeks, the German army had done what 4 years of the First World War could not, and the whole Atlantic coastline of France, from the Channel down to the Spanish border, was now theirs. For most of the Wehrmacht, that was a triumph of tanks and infantry. For one man, it was something else entirely. Karl Donitz commanded Germany's submarine fleet, and he had spent the first year of the war fighting under a crippling disadvantage. His U-boats were based in Germany. Every time one went out to hunt, it had to sail the long way around the top of Scotland, burning days and fuel just to reach the open Atlantic, and then make the same long journey home. The boats spent more time traveling than fighting. Now, suddenly, Donitz had the coast of France. He could base his submarines hundreds of miles closer to the shipping lanes, and in doing so, he could nearly double the time each boat spent on the hunt. Within days of the occupation, he had chosen his main prize. Lorient, a working naval port in Brittany, with a deep harbor and direct access to the Atlantic that had belonged to the French Navy for centuries. It already had dry docks, workshops, and skilled hands, everything needed to service a fleet of submarines, and it sat on the open ocean with nothing between it and the convoy lanes. For Donitz's purposes, it was close to perfect. He moved his own headquarters into a chateau at Kernevel, on the water just across the bay, close enough to watch his boats come and go. From a room there, Donitz ran the wolfpacks, the coordinated groups of submarines that fell on the convoys in the night, and Lorient became the beating heart of the campaign the Allies came to call the Battle of the Atlantic. It was a campaign Britain came terrifyingly close to losing. Britain is an island, and in 1940 it could not feed or arm itself without the convoys, the long lines of merchant ships that carried food, fuel, and weapons across the Atlantic from North America. cut those convoys, and Britain would starve into surrender without a single German soldier setting foot on its soil. Dönitz understood this better than almost anyone, and his U-boats set out to do exactly that. In 1942 alone, they sent 8 million tons of Allied shipping to the bottom of the sea. They were sinking ships faster than the shipyards could build them. Winston Churchill later admitted that the only thing in the entire war that ever truly frightened him was the U-boat threat. For the submarine crews, the early years were the golden months they would remember for the rest of their lives. The period they called the happy time, when the convoys were poorly defended and the hunting was easy. A boat would come back from a patrol flying a pennant from its periscope for each ship it had sunk, and a band would be waiting on the quay to meet it. There were hotels, hot food, and rest, and then the boats went out again. Lorient was where the wolfpacks were unleashed. Dönitz's tactic of gathering his submarines into a group and hurling them all at once against a single convoy in the dark, swamping the escorts and slaughtering the merchant ships one after another. He ran it all by radio from his chateau at Kernevel, moving his boats across the ocean like pieces on a board. And the machine that produced that fear ate, slept, and rearmed at Lorient. But a submarine in port is a submarine that cannot fight. And worse, it is a target. Dönitz understood from the first that his boats were most vulnerable not at sea, but at home, tied up at the quay where a single well-aimed bomb could destroy a machine that had taken months to build. So he asked for the impossible. He wanted his submarines protected by concrete so thick that no bomb could reach them. In the autumn of 1940, the order came down from Hitler himself, and the job was handed to the organization TOD, the vast Nazi construction agency that built the regime's fortifications and highways. What they raised at Lorient over the next 2 years is still difficult to comprehend when you stand beneath it. 15,000 workers labored on the site. German engineers, French contractors, and thousands of forced laborers housed in camps around the port. They began with 2 strange structures shaped like the naves of cathedrals, nicknamed the Dom bunkers, each large enough to shelter a single submarine hauled up out of the water. Then they tried building protected docks on the banks of a nearby river, only to find the ground there too soft to carry the weight and so prone to silting that it needed constant dredging. That was not going to work either. So they went to the rocky Karaman Peninsula and began to pour the 3 great blocks that still stand there today. Karaman 1 rose in about 7 months, an insane pace explained by the simple fact that British bombs were already falling as the concrete set. Karaman 2 went up beside it. Karaman 3, the largest, could hold more than a dozen boats at once. The bedrock was too hard to dig deep, wet pens for every submarine, so the engineers solved the problem with an ingenious piece of machinery. A U-boat would sail into a single wet dock, and there a slipway and a moving cradle would lift the whole boat clean out of the water and roll it on rails, sideways, into an individual concrete cell, like a car being parked in a garage, except the car weighed several hundred tons, and the garage had walls of bomb-proof stone. The numbers behind it all are staggering, something close to 1 million cubic meters of concrete. Tens of thousands of wagons of sand and stone brought in on railway lines laid specially for the purpose. Much of the back-breaking labor was done by forced workers, men conscripted from across occupied Europe and driven hard in the camps that ringed the site. People compelled to build the shelter that protected the weapon starving their own countries. A 4th great block, Karaman 4, was begun in 1943 for Germany's newest submarines, but the bombing and the collapse of the front meant it was never finished. And above the pens sat the thing that mattered most: the roof. In places, it reached more than 7 meters of solid reinforced concrete. When the Allied bombs kept coming, the Germans did not simply make it thicker. They made it smarter, adding a second roof above the first with an open gap between them. The idea was brutally simple. A bomb would smash into the upper slab and detonate there, and its force would blow harmlessly into the empty space instead of driving down into the pens below. They had engineered a building specifically to defeat the weapons being thrown at it. When it was finished, the base could shelter around 30 submarines at once, and its designers believed nothing on Earth could break it. They were about to be proven right, over and over again. The Allies were not slow to understand what Lorient represented. From very early in the war, bombers came for the base. The first bombs had actually fallen on Lorient back in September 1940, before the pens even existed. Once the concrete was up, the Royal Air Force came, and later the heavy bombers of the American 8th Air Force joined them, and raid after raid after raid was flown against the pens. The Americans tried their new doctrine of high-altitude precision bombing, sending tight formations of B-17 flying fortresses over the port in daylight to place their bombs exactly on the roofs. The results were almost nothing. Precision meant nothing when the target could absorb a direct hit and barely notice. The bombs that struck the roofs cracked and burst and left craters in the concrete, and the submarines underneath rode it out, sometimes with their crews sleeping through the attack. In London, the failure became a subject of quiet embarrassment. It was even raised in the House of Commons, where a member asked whether the bombs were actually breaking through what he called the U-boat kennels. They were not. Concrete was winning. The men flying the missions were dying. Bombers were lost. Crews were killed, and the thing they were dying to destroy sat under its roof and did not care. For an air force built on the belief that bombing could win wars, Lorient was a humiliation cast in reinforced concrete, and it forced a decision that remains one of the most uncomfortable of the entire Allied campaign. If you cannot kill the submarines, the reasoning went, then kill everything around them. On the 14th of January 1943, Winston Churchill personally ordered a change of plan. The bombers would stop trying to crack the impenetrable pens and would instead destroy the town of Lorient itself, the workers' housing, the streets, the dockside, the supply lines, to starve the base of the labor and the resources it needed to keep the U-boats fed and armed. It is worth being clear about what that meant. Lorient was not a German city. It was a French town full of French civilians, an Allied population living under occupation, and the plan was to erase it. The decision was pushed by Churchill and the Admiralty over the objections of some of his own senior air commanders and his Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden. This was the scale of destruction usually reserved for cities inside Germany, now being turned deliberately on the town of an ally. But the U-boats were sinking ships faster than Britain could replace them, and to Churchill and his admirals, that single fear outweighed every other consideration. Before the raids, aircraft scattered thousands of leaflets over the town, warning the inhabitants to get out. Most of them did. 40,000 people fled into the countryside. They left with what they could carry, abandoning homes their families had lived in for generations, and many of them would return, if they returned at all, to find nothing standing where their streets had been. And then, between the middle of January and the middle of February 1943, the bombers came in force. They dropped hundreds of high-explosive bombs and more than 60,000 incendiaries. The medieval and neo-Gothic heart of Lorient, the churches, the shops, the homes, the covered market, caught fire and collapsed. Around 3,500 buildings were destroyed. When it was over, close to 90% of the town simply did not exist anymore. Because the population had been evacuated first, the death toll was, by the standards of the air war, relatively low. But an entire French town had been deliberately wiped off the map by its own side, and within weeks, the area bombing of the Biscay ports was quietly judged a failure and abandoned. It had burned a French town to the ground and done almost nothing to slow the base. The rubble was cleared enough, the supply lines were patched, and the submarines kept sailing. And here is the detail that turns the whole story bitter. When the smoke cleared and the rubble cooled, the submarine pens on the Karaman Peninsula stood exactly as they had before, untouched. The town was gone, and the fortress it had been built to serve had not lost a single stone. The bombing did not stop there, and neither did the ingenuity of the men trying to break the base. As Allied bomb design improved, the weapons got bigger and heavier and meaner, until they reached the Tall Boy, a 12,000-pound earthquake bomb designed by the British engineer Barnes Wallis to defeat anything ever built. Its principle was fiendish. Rather than simply smashing down onto a target, it was built to plunge deep and detonate below, shaking a structure apart from underneath like a small private earthquake, the same weapon that had already broken other hardened German targets. In August 1944, the Royal Air Force dropped one of these monsters directly onto the roof of Karaman 3. It was the ultimate test, the heaviest, most advanced bomb the Allies possessed against the strongest roof the Germans had ever poured. The double roof did its job. The bomb detonated on the upper slab, cracked a beam, and blew itself out in the gap between the two layers. The pens beneath were fine. You can still stand up there today and see the place where the beam broke, a small wound in a structure that swallowed the worst blow the air war could deliver and kept standing. At other submarine bases along the Biscay coast, those same earthquake bombs would eventually manage to punch through the roofs late in 1944, but not at Lorient. By the time the tall boys were falling, the Allied High Command had already come to the conclusion the airmen had resisted for years. General Eisenhower himself decided that the U-boat fortresses of France were simply not worth the cost of destroying, and that they should be surrounded and contained rather than bombed. The concrete had won its long argument. The bombers gave up on it. By the end, more than 500 air raids had been flown against Lorient over the course of the war, and the tally was almost surreal. Of the 168 U-boats based at Lorient across the whole conflict, roughly 135 were sunk by the Allies. That is around 80%, a catastrophic loss rate for the submarine crews, most of whom were young men who never came home. But look closely at where they died. Not one of them was destroyed inside the pens. Every one of those submarines was killed out at sea, in the gray wastes of the Atlantic, far from the concrete that had been built to keep them safe. The base did exactly what it was designed to do. It protected the submarines right up until the moment they sailed out to be hunted down and killed somewhere else. It is worth stopping on those men for a moment, because the numbers hide them. The German submarine service suffered the highest casualty rate of any branch of any military on any side in the entire war. Of the roughly 40,000 men who went to sea in the U-boats, some 30,000 never came back. They were mostly very young. They died in steel tubes crushed by depth charges or caught on the surface by aircraft they never saw, in cold black water 1,000 miles from any shore. Lorient sent them out, and Lorient took the survivors back, and the great majority of the crews that sailed from these pens simply vanished into the Atlantic. The safest submarine base in the world was the front door to the deadliest job in the war. And that points to the real answer to the question this whole story is built on. The base the bombers could never crack was cracked, in the end, by a very different kind of weapon. His name was Jacques Stoskopf, and for most of the war, the people of Lorient hated him. Stoskopf was a French naval engineer, an Alsatian who spoke fluent German. He had fought in the First World War as a young officer and been decorated for bravery, then trained as one of France's finest marine engineers at the École Polytechnique. Before the Second World War, he had been one of the senior men at the Lorient shipyard, the deputy director of naval construction. When the Germans took over the port and began building their U-boat base, they needed exactly his expertise, and Stoskopf gave it to them. He stayed at his post. He worked alongside the German engineers. He helped run the arsenal where the U-boats were serviced and repaired. To the townspeople watching a Frenchman in a suit walk into the German base every morning, the conclusion was obvious and damning. Stoskopf was a collaborator, a traitor working hand in glove with the occupiers who were building the machine that killed Allied sailors. They were completely wrong. From September 1940, Jacques Stoskopf had been feeding the Allies a steady stream of the most valuable intelligence in the Battle of the Atlantic. His position gave him something no spy on the outside could ever have. He could see the submarines. He knew which boats were in the pens, which were being repaired, and, most crucially, which were about to sail and when. He memorized it all. He took no notes and no photographs that could ever betray him, carrying the information out in his head and passing it to the Alliance Network, the French resistance group that funneled it to the Royal Navy. And he did more than watch. Under his supervision, work on the German boats was quietly sabotaged, flawed welds, materials that were not quite right, repairs that took longer than they should have, small acts of engineering treachery that sent submarines back to sea a little weaker than their crews believed. Time and again, a U-boat that slipped out of Lorient believing itself safe was sailing toward an ambush that had been arranged before it even cleared the harbor. The concrete could stop a bomb. It could not stop a man with a good memory and a reason to use it. The Germans never suspected the quiet engineer they trusted. What undid him was not his own mistake, but someone else's. A captured member of the Alliance Network, tortured by the Gestapo, gave up his name. Stoskopf was arrested in February 1944. He was taken away under the Nazis' night and fog program, the policy designed to make resistance prisoners simply vanish without trace, and he was sent to the Natzweiler Struthof camp in the mountains of Alsace, the only concentration camp the Germans built on French soil. There, condemned as a night and fog prisoner, a man meant to disappear so completely that even his own family would never learn what had become of him, he waited out his final months among other captured members of the resistance. On the 1st of September 1944, as the Allies were closing in and the camp was being emptied, Jacques Stoskopf was executed. His own town had spent 4 years believing he was a traitor. It would take his death and the end of the war for them to learn that the man they despised had been one of the most effective resistance agents in France. Charles de Gaulle posthumously made him a commander of the Legion of Honor, astonishing the very people who had spent 4 years certain he was a traitor. In 1946, the French Navy renamed the entire submarine base in his honor. Decades later, the Navy would name a warship after him too, a quiet acknowledgement that in a war of guns and torpedoes, the man who did the most damage from Lorient never fired a shot. The fortress the bombs could not crack now carries the name of the man who cracked it. If this story is landing the way it landed on us while we researched it, take a moment to subscribe. For all its concrete, Lorient could never save the U-boat war because that war was being lost out on the ocean not in the pens. In the spring of 1943, the balance turned, and it turned with brutal speed. The Allies had finally learned how to fight back. Escort ships and long-range aircraft closed the gap in the middle of the Atlantic where the U-boats had hunted freely for years. Radar found the submarines on the surface at night, where they had always been safe. And code breakers, reading the German signals, could steer the convoys around the waiting wolfpacks entirely. In a single month, often remembered as Black May, Dönitz lost dozens of boats and the young crews inside them. It was more than even he could accept. He pulled his submarines back from the North Atlantic, and the great slaughter of the convoys came to an end. The base at Lorient was as strong as it had ever been. The fleet it sheltered had been broken at sea. By the time Stoskopf was killed, the war had already moved past Lorient, and the base was becoming something stranger than a fortress. It was becoming a trap. In June 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy, and in the weeks that followed, they broke out and swept across France. On the 12th of August 1944, American and Free French forces surrounded Lorient completely, sealing the German garrison inside a pocket on the coast. The remaining U-boats were pulled out while there was still time. The very last one to leave, a boat called U-853, slipped out at the end of August 1944 and ran for Norway, and it would be hunted down and sunk off the coast of America in the final days of the war, a fitting end for the last submarine to flee Lorient. With the boats gone, the base had lost its entire reason to exist. The pens were now empty concrete boxes on a coast that no longer mattered to the outcome of the war. And yet the German garrison did not surrender. Cut off, surrounded, useless, the defenders of what the Germans called Festung Lorient, Fortress Lorient, simply dug in and held on. The Allies, sensibly, decided not to waste lives storming a pocket that could do them no harm, and so they left it besieged and moved on to fight the war that actually counted. Month after month, the garrison sat inside its ring of enemy troops in the ruins of a town it had helped destroy, guarding submarine pens that had no submarines. There was no glory left in it, and no purpose, just cold, hunger, and waiting on both sides of the wire. The defenders held a fortress that guarded nothing. The besiegers watched a garrison that could go nowhere. Now and then there were skirmishes along the line, men killed for a pocket that changed nothing at all, while the real war roared away to the east. It held through the autumn. It held through the winter. It held while the Red Army closed on Berlin and the Reich collapsed. Lorient did not surrender until the second week of May 1945, after Hitler was dead, after Germany itself had already capitulated, one of the very last German holdouts of the entire war. The men there gave up, not because they were beaten in battle, but because there was no longer any Germany left to fight for. The fortress had outlived its purpose by the better part of a year, and it had never once been taken. It was simply, finally, no longer needed. When the garrison marched out at last, the French found the base almost exactly as the Germans had left it. The pens were intact. The roofs were intact. The concrete that had defeated 4,000 tons of bombs was still there, as solid as the day it was poured, waiting for a use. The French Navy took it over and put its own submarines where the U-boats had once slept, and it kept the base in service for the next 50 years, under the name of the engineer the Germans had executed. For half a century, French boats glided in and out of the pens that had been built to shelter their enemies, and the great gray blocks that had once been the terror of the Atlantic became something almost mundane, A working naval dockyard, humming quietly along in a corner of Brittany, its monstrous history folded away inside the routine of peacetime. Only in the 1990s did the Navy finally leave, and then the town was left with the same problem the bombers had once faced from the air. What do you do with something that cannot be destroyed? To demolish the Karaman bunkers would have cost a fortune. Estimates ran to more than 30 million euros, and even that assumed it could be done at all. The concrete that had shrugged off tall boys was not going to come down easily for a wrecking crew. So Lorient made the only sensible choice left. It kept them. It cleaned them out and moved life back inside them. Today, the base the bombers could never crack is a place people visit for pleasure. One of the great gray blocks now houses a museum devoted to sailing and the sea, named for Eric Tabarly, the famous French yachtsman who built some of his own boats in this very port. In the old pens, where U-boats once dripped and idled in the dark, a preserved submarine sits open for tourists, and children walk the gangways above the water where the wolfpacks once tied up. Visitors climb onto the roof itself, the roof that beat the tall boy, and stand on an old anti-aircraft position looking out over the harbor toward the chateau across the bay where Donitz once directed the killing. Around the bunkers, the marina fills with the bright sails of a town that rebuilt itself from nothing after 1943 and turned back toward the ocean that had brought it so much grief. Every August, the port fills for a great Celtic music festival, and racing yachts prepared in the old submarine sheds set out to cross the same Atlantic the U-boats once terrorized. The concrete is still there. It will be there for centuries. It is too strong to fall and too vast to hide, a permanent monument that no one exactly chose to keep. The Germans built it to prove that some things could be made invulnerable, and they were right. The walls never failed. 4,000 tons of bombs, more than 500 raids, the heaviest weapon in the Allied inventory, and the roofs held every single time. But invulnerability turned out to be the wrong thing to build. What the concrete could not protect against was a war that was decided somewhere else entirely, out on the gray Atlantic where the crews died, in the code-breaking rooms where the convoys were saved, and inside the head of a quiet French engineer, the Germans trusted to the end. The pens kept every promise their designers made them. They simply could not keep the only one that mattered, which was to matter at all. And that may be the strangest thing about standing beneath them now, in the sunshine, with the sails going by. The base won every fight the bombers ever brought to it, and it still lost the war. The question it leaves you with is whether a fortress that cannot be beaten and cannot win is a triumph of engineering, or just the most permanent kind of monument to everything engineering could not save. If you made it to the end of this one, you already know this channel is for you. Subscribe so you do not miss the next deep dive. We have more places like Lorient coming, and every one of them has a story the rest of the internet forgot.